1853. He believed his radical philosophy was right. The terrifying story of Elias Varnholt will make you shiver. In the winter of 1853, a mysterious figure appeared in Cold Hollow, a small mining town deep in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, a figure that would sow a terror that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. They called him Elias Varnholt, though that name did not exist in any records before that grim February night when he emerged from a blizzard that had buried all the town's hope under a thick layer of ice. What the townspeople discovered about this man, who claimed to be a wandering botanist and demonstrated timeless knowledge of medicinal herbs that saved dozens of lives amidst starvation and disease, would shatter their faith in human nature and expose the raw truths of survival that civilized minds always refuse to confront. For over a century and a half, the records of Cold Hollow have been sealed, hidden from curious eyes. These documents not only reveal who Elias Varnholt truly was, but also what he had done to survive in the frozen wilderness, and more terrifyingly, what he continued to do long after being welcomed as a savior. The truth about Elias Varnholt is not just a story of survival gone awry. It is a gruesome testament to how far a human can fall when stripped of their societal veneer, and how monsters can hide behind the masks of heroes while silently poisoning an entire community with their twisted and brutal philosophy of existence. Before we delve into the story of Elias Varnholt and the winter that changed Cold Hollow forever, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell, because stories like this dig deep into the darkest corners of American history. And let us know where you're listening from, as you might be surprised how many unsolved disappearances occurred in your area during the brutal winters of the 1850 seconds. The chain of mysterious disappearances that followed Elias Varnholt's path through the Adirondacks and neighboring regions affected dozens of families across New York and Pennsylvania, but the authorities never connected the dots until it was all too late. The documents I am about to share with you come from private records that have never been published, and for good reason. They contain details about human nature that most people are not prepared to face. Cold Hollow, New York, in 1853, was the kind of place where survival depended on how well you knew your neighbors. Tucked away in a frigid valley in the Adirondack Mountains, nearly a week's carriage ride from Albany, the town had fewer than 200 residents, mostly miners, farmers, and their families, trying to wring a living from the cold earth. The settlement was founded in 1810 by those searching for iron ore, but by the 1850 seconds, it had become one of those forgotten communities, existing in isolation, connected to the outside world only by treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during the long winter months. The winter of 1852 to 1853 was particularly brutal. The temperature dropped so low that the town's doctor, Caleb Morrow, who had studied medicine in Philadelphia but moved to Cold Hollow to escape his past after a failed surgery, recorded in his journal that even the holy water in the church froze solid. The Sacandaga River, the town's only source of water and transport route, had been frozen thick since November. Even the hardiest miners, men accustomed to mountain winters, whispered that this winter carried an ancient evil. The heart of the town was Mrs. Martha Cleary's Tavern, a two-story wooden building that served as both a residence and the only place with any warmth left in town. Mrs. Cleary, a tough widow who took over the business after her husband died in a mine collapse, ran the place with an iron fist. Her tavern was the public's gathering place, where they exchanged scant news and sought some comfort on the endless winter nights. Her ledger would later become a crucial piece of evidence, documenting the disturbing change in the community since Elias Varnholt's arrival. At the other end of the main road was Dr. Morrow's practice, where the medicine cabinet was nearly empty. He was struggling with rising cases of infection and malnutrition. The small white church, where Pastor Amos Whitlock preached to an ever-dwindling congregation, stood alone in the square. Pastor Whitlock, a devout man with dreams of building a strong community, was now facing a crisis of faith. The harsh reality of surviving in such an isolated place was testing everyone's belief in God's mercy. Most families lived in rickety log cabins, heated by whatever firewood they had managed to stockpile before the heavy snow turned the forests into a deadly white labyrinth. The wealthier families, like that of the tavern owner Martha Cleary, had a sturdier two-story house with a large fireplace and a cellar full of potatoes and salted meat. Mrs. Martha had one son, Daniel, 13, a bright and curious boy who kept an eye on everything that happened in the town. He was his mother's eyes and ears in this small community. By February 1853, Cold Hollow was drowning in despair. Far beyond the hardships of previous winters, the town had already lost 6 people to the cold and disease. Old Silas Croft, a veteran hunter and the only one who knew the secret trails in the forest, was found frozen to death in his hut after his fire went out. He was the one who used to tell the children stories about mythical creatures in the mountains. The youngest child of the Weaver family had died from an unknown fever, despite Dr. Morrow using his last remedies, leaving the young mother in a state of silent grief. The most worrying thing was the depletion of food and medicine. The last supply wagon had arrived in October, and no one dared hope for more supplies until the ice melted at the end of April. Dr. Morrow's medical supplies were now just an empty cabinet. He was down to his last few doses of laudanum, and his surgical instruments were so dull that he feared performing even a simple operation. People began to whisper about the curse of the mountain, that this winter had come to reclaim what man had taken from the earth. Some families were already planning to abandon Cold Hollow entirely as soon as the road was clear. It was into this desperate and isolated world that Elias Varnholt emerged from the storm, carrying knowledge and remedies that seemed like a miracle. And as the wretched people of Cold Hollow were about to discover, they were. But every miracle has a price. The night of the 12th of February, 1853. This date was permanently frozen in the memory of every family in Cold Hollow who survived the nightmare that followed. It was recorded not only in Dr. Morrow's cramped medical log, but also in the private diary of Mrs. Martha Cleary and the trembling accounts of witnesses. Young Daniel Cleary, Martha's 3-year-old son, was the first to spot the figure. He was reinforcing the stable door against the blizzard, which was howling like a damned soul, when he saw what looked like a ghost stepping out of the whiteout. Daniel's first instinct was to rub his eyes, thinking it was just a hallucination born of exhaustion and the flickering lantern light. But as he looked closer, the shape resolved into the unmistakable form of a man. The person moved with purpose, walking steadily down the slope into town with a cold confidence that seemed impossible in the midst of the storm. Most people lost in blizzards would stumble, disoriented, until they collapsed and were buried by the snow. This man was different. He walked as if following an invisible path only he could see. Daniel rushed into the tavern to call his mother, and within minutes, the bravest men in town had gathered by the window, holding their breath as they watched the stranger approach. What they saw defied all their understanding of human limits. The figure walked upright, head-on against gusts of wind that could knock over a cow. His pace was steady, unhurried, as if he were taking a stroll on a calm autumn afternoon, instead of facing a fury that had claimed the lives of so many unfortunate souls. Elias Varnholt arrived at the tavern, looking as if he had just stepped out of another world. His clothes were strange, made of materials no tailor or hunter in Cold Hollow had ever seen. The long outer cloak was made of what looked like treated animal hide, but it was light and soft, and the snow simply slid off its surface without leaving it wet. Underneath, he wore a layered suit of tightly woven fabric that had a faint metallic sheen in the light. But his boots were the most curious thing. They were exquisitely crafted, leaving strange tracks in the snow, deep and clear, with a distinct pattern that looked like complex geometric carvings. Dr. Morrow later sketched these tracks in his journal, noting, "They are unlike any footwear I have ever seen, either in Philadelphia or in European books. They were made to conquer treacherous terrain, showing a level of craftsmanship and specialized knowledge entirely inconsistent with the story of a lost botanist." But it was Varnholt's physical condition that truly unsettled the seasoned men. Despite claiming to have wandered for days in the White Death, he showed no signs of severe frostbite. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold. Yes, but his fingers and extremities were completely intact, without a single bruise from the frost. He moved with agility and spoke coherently, which was impossible for someone who had just escaped the blizzard's clutches. His movement was fluid and controlled, his voice clear and calm. Dr. Morrow examined him thoroughly and found this so extraordinary that he wrote extensively about it, theorizing that Varnholt must have had adequate shelter and supplies far more recently than his story suggested. The man himself was tall and lean, with the physique of someone who had spent a lifetime facing harsh nature. His dark hair was streaked with silver, though he looked no older than 40. His hands were calloused and covered in old scars, his shoulders broad, and his legs sturdy like those of a man who had walked thousands of miles over the most difficult terrain. But it was his face that seared itself into everyone's memory. The features were sharp and angular, with high cheekbones and a straight nose, giving him the look of a patient predator. His skin was weathered but perfectly healthy, with none of the pallor or signs of malnutrition of someone who had been struggling to survive. Most memorable were his eyes, a cold gray, almost devoid of color, like a frozen lake in winter. The way he looked at people made them feel deeply uneasy, as if he were silently measuring them for some purpose they couldn't comprehend. Children, like Daniel Cleary, were drawn to him in the way they are drawn to a dangerous wild animal, while adults instinctively felt the need to keep their distance. Several townspeople later described the strange feeling that Varnholt was silently memorizing everything he saw: the layout of the town, the habits of each family, the relationships and power dynamics within the community. When he spoke, it was in perfect English, but with an intonation that no one in Cold Hollow could place. It wasn't a New England accent, nor was it European. Dr. Morrow, who had encountered many people from all over the world, described it in his diary as a voice that seemed to borrow from many languages but belonged to none. Varnholt's vocabulary was erudite and precise, suggesting a formal education, yet he occasionally used words or phrases that were archaic or simply completely foreign to his listeners. His story, when he finally told it, was both compelling and deeply unsettling. He claimed to have come from beyond the highest mountains, from lands where the seasons follow older laws. When pressed for details about his homeland, he became vague, speaking only of "my people" and the land where wisdom comes from accepting the necessary cruelty of nature. He described a community that lived in harmony with the most brutal aspects of the wild, where survival was not about fighting the wilderness, but about understanding and becoming a part of it. Children were drawn to him. They would gather around whenever he told stories of frozen forests and strange customs. The adults found him deeply unsettling but couldn't articulate why. There was something in the way he moved, the way he observed everything around him, the way his cold gray eyes seemed to see through people's souls rather than just look at them, that triggered an instinctual alarm in anyone who stood near him for too long. However, the most disturbing aspect of Elias Varnholt's arrival was what he carried with him. In a leather satchel he never let out of his sight, a bag made of the same strange waterproof material as his cloak, he kept what he called his medicines and botanist's tools. The contents of this bag would later become the source of the town's worst nightmares. But in those first few days, desperate and destitute, the people of Cold Hollow welcomed what seemed like divine intervention in their darkest hour. That very first night, as Varnholt sat by the fire in Martha's Tavern, warming himself with a mug of strong corn whiskey, he began to demonstrate the knowledge that would make him indispensable to the community. When young Hannah Weaver began to cough violently, a rattling cough that had worsened over the past week and made Dr. Morrow fear pneumonia, Varnholt listened carefully to the sound from her chest. He immediately diagnosed the problem as a lung infection caused by inhaling cold, damp air for too long. From his mysterious bag, he produced a small vial containing a dark liquid that smelled of roots and something else, a pungent, organic scent that no one could identify. He instructed Hannah to take just 3 drops mixed with hot water. Within an hour, her coughing had subsided significantly. By the next morning, she was breathing normally for the first time in weeks. News of this miraculous cure spread through Cold Hollow like wildfire in a windstorm. By the end of Elias Varnholt's first full day in town, half the community was lined up outside the tavern, carrying their frail hopes of being cured of the ailments that had plagued them all winter. Within days, Elias Varnholt had established himself as Cold Hollow's savior, though his methods were unlike anything the townspeople had ever witnessed. Dr. Morrow initially skeptical of anyone claiming medical knowledge without a degree, became grudgingly impressed by the stranger's accurate diagnoses and the incredible effectiveness of his treatments. Varnholt could diagnose an illness just by listening to a person's breathing, identifying conditions that had baffled Dr. Morrow for weeks. He knew exactly which roots to find even when they were buried under several feet of snow. And most remarkably, his treatments worked with an efficiency that bordered on miraculous. When the weaver's youngest daughter showed symptoms that Dr. Morrow feared was the same winter fever that had killed so many in the past, Varnholt prepared a thick, dark concoction. It involved boiling several strange roots with what he called specially preserved mountain meat, prepared according to the traditions of my ancestors. The process took hours and required ingredients that Varnholt produced from small wooden boxes in his seemingly bottomless leather satchel. The smell that emanated from his pot was unlike anything the townspeople had ever smelled. It was sickly sweet, mingled with an underlying foul odor that reminded some of the smell of animal traps left too long in the woods. Mrs. Martha Cleary, who prided herself on her cooking skills, could not identify any of the scents. When she asked about the ingredients, Varnholt just smiled mysteriously and explained that his people had developed these preservation techniques over generations to survive the harshest conditions. The remedy worked. The weaver girl recovered completely within a few days, though she complained of vivid nightmares, of cold lands and hungry eyes watching her from the darkness. She spoke of dreams of walking through endless fields of snow, where shadowy figures called her name in a strange language, promising warmth and sustenance if she would join their eternal feast. Her parents were so grateful that they gave Varnholt the warmest room in their house, despite Dr. Morrow's hesitant warnings. It was Mrs. Weaver who first noticed Varnholt's strange habits and began to note them in the family Bible. These notes later became crucial evidence. Varnholt never slept for more than 2 or 3 hours at a time and always kept one ear listening, as if expecting some unseen enemy to find him. He would often wake up multiple times during the night and sit motionless by the window, staring out at the snow-covered darkness with an intense focus that made the family deeply uncomfortable. He would often disappear for hours in the middle of the worst storms, saying he needed to find special herbs that only grow in blizzards. These trips seemed impossible. The winds howled, capable of tearing roofs off, and the temperature could kill a healthy man in minutes. Yet, Varnholt always returned from these mysterious journeys, his strange boots only slightly damp, carrying things that should have been impossible to find in the Adirondacks in winter. Fresh meat was the most puzzling thing. While the best hunters of Cold Hollow hadn't found a single animal track in weeks and were surviving on salted meat, Varnholt regularly returned with what he claimed was venison or rabbit he had trapped. The meat looked very fresh and was expertly butchered, cut into perfect portions that he said was the traditional method of his people. But some of the experienced hunters in town began to notice that the cuts looked not quite right. The bone structure seemed strange, and the meat itself had a texture and color that didn't match any local game they had ever hunted. The bone structure seemed wrong for the animals Varnholt claimed they came from, and the meat itself had a texture and color that didn't match any game in the region. Dr. Morrow, whose medical training included knowledge of human anatomy, grew increasingly uneasy about Varnholt's mountain meat. During one observation of Varnholt preparing his medicine, Morrow noticed strips of muscle tissue that looked alarmingly similar to human muscle. When he cautiously raised this concern, the stranger just laughed, a cold laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You must understand, Doctor," Varnholt said with that unsettling smile, "that survival in the true wilderness requires one to abandon the squeamish attitudes of civilized society. My ancestors learned long ago that, fundamentally, all meat is the same. It all provides the necessary nutrients to sustain life, regardless of its origin. What is important is the proper preparation and the respectful attitude with which one consumes what nature provides." One morning, Martha Cleary saw him carefully cleaning what appeared to be a woman's silver hair brooch, polishing it with a soft cloth, while humming a tune she had never heard, yet which felt hauntingly familiar. The melody was simple, but deeply unsettling, with a slow rhythm that reminded her of funeral dirges. When she asked about the brooch, he smiled and said, "It belonged to a dear friend from my homeland, one who could not complete the journey, but whose spirit always travels with me." but Martha could have sworn she had seen that exact brooch before. It belonged to Evelyn Pike, the wife of a forest ranger who had disappeared with her husband and 2 children on their way to another town last fall. They had been traveling through these mountains when an early storm hit, and despite extensive searches, not a trace of them was ever found. The brooch was very distinctive, silver, carved in the shape of a delicate hummingbird. Martha had admired it many times when the Pike family stopped by her tavern. The room where Varnholt stayed became a source of growing unease. Strange sounds emanated from it at night, soft scraping and tapping noises, as if someone were working with small tools. Occasionally, it was punctuated by sounds that resembled a muffled sob or a weak whimper. The sounds were so faint they could have been mistaken for the groaning of the log house or the wind in the walls, but they had a pattern, a rhythm that suggested deliberate activity. When Martha, unable to bear it any longer, finally mustered the courage to ask about the sounds, Varnholt explained that he was working on maps to find my way back when the snows melt, and a botanical journal to record my discoveries during my time with you. He showed Martha complex drawings on thin, treated hide, marked with strange symbols and notes in a language no one in Cold Hollow could understand. The maps were incredibly detailed, showing topographical features, wind currents, and routes through a land that seemed far vaster than anything visible from the town. But these maps told a disturbing story to anyone who looked closely enough to understand their implications. They detailed every trail, every cave, and every shelter in the surrounding mountains, every place a person could take refuge during a storm. More troublingly, they had notes in that mysterious language, marking certain locations with symbols that looked disturbingly like tally marks. A few areas were circled with numbers next to them, suggesting Varnholt was keeping account of something or someone. Dr. Morrow, whose initial curiosity had turned into deep suspicion, began to document every aspect of Varnholt's behavior and the effects of his remedies on the townspeople. What he recorded would later become crucial evidence in understanding the true nature of what was happening in Cold Hollow. The first disturbing pattern Morrow noticed was how Varnholt's patients reacted to the treatments. While the immediate effects were always positive, symptoms vanished, strength returned. There were subtle behavioral changes that appeared over time. Patients treated by Varnholt began to crave meat with an intense fervor, an unusual thing when protein was so scarce. They also became more aggressive and territorial, guarding their food supplies excessively, far beyond normal survival instincts. More troubling were the psychological changes. Several of Varnholt's patients began to have identical nightmares, dreams of walking through endless white snowfields, where shadowy figures invited them to join an eternal feast in exchange for warmth and sustenance. These dreams were so vivid and consistent that Morrow began to suspect some form of mass psychological manipulation, perhaps through ingredients in Varnholt's medicines that affected brain function. The breaking point in Dr. Morrow's suspicion came when he decided to analyze one of Varnholt's medicinal preparations using his medical techniques. Using his old microscope brought from Philadelphia, Morrow was horrified to discover human hair fibers and microscopic bone fragments in a powder that Varnholt claimed was made from mountain roots and minerals. When confronted with this evidence, Varnholt's reaction was swift and chillingly cold. Instead of denying or feigning surprise, he seemed pleased that Dr. Morrow was intelligent enough to discover the truth. "Ah, doctor," Varnholt said, his cold gray eyes glinting with something akin to admiration. "I had hoped that a man of your education would understand the true nature of my work. Yes, your analysis is entirely correct. The most effective remedies are those that incorporate elements from the ultimate source of life, man himself." Dr. Morrow's blood ran cold as Varnholt calmly continued his explanation. "In my homeland, we learned long ago that the human body contains all the elements necessary to heal and strengthen other bodies. When prepared correctly, according to the ancient traditions passed down through generations, human tissue becomes the most potent medicine. It creates a bond between those who share it, a communion deeper than any prayer you could offer." The implications of Varnholt's words struck Morrow like a physical blow. This man was not only feeding human remains to the townspeople as medicine, but he was doing so as part of a deliberate plan to psychologically condition them, to make them accept cannibalism as normal, even necessary. The nightmares, the behavioral changes, the meat cravings, All were part of a systematic process to break down the final psychological barrier of a civilized human being. As February bled into March, the situation in Cold Hollow grew darker and more complex. Elias Varnholt's medical successes continued to mount, but so did the strange incidents and unsettling discoveries surrounding his presence. Dr. Morrow began to keep detailed notes on Varnholt's methods, partly out of medical curiosity and partly out of a growing fear that something abominable was happening to his community under the guise of healing. Varnholt's kit contained instruments that Dr. Morrow had never seen in any medical textbook. There were knives with unusual curved blades, designed more for flaying than for surgery. Small saws with teeth arranged in a pattern meant for efficiently cutting through bone, and numerous vials containing powders and liquids that gave off a scent unlike any known pharmaceutical. When Morrow expressed interest in learning more, Varnholt would always deflect with complex explanations about ancestral secrets and sacred knowledge that loses its power if seen by the uninitiated. The breakthrough in understanding Varnholt's true nature came when young Daniel Cleary, Martha's son, made a discovery that would change everything. Curious about Varnholt's mysterious trips, Daniel had secretly followed him deep into the forest. He found what he initially thought was a natural sinkhole at the base of a giant pine tree. The entrance was obscured by dry branches and snow, almost invisible unless you looked closely. But as Daniel curiously cleared the entrance, he realized someone had turned this space into an extremely well-organized storage cellar. The entrance led to a natural chamber in the earth, which had been dug out and reinforced to create a sophisticated cache for preserving supplies. The walls were lined with a type of treated hide, but its texture and smell were unlike anything local hunters had ever produced. Inside this secret repository, wrapped in the same strange leather-like material as Varnholt's clothes, were items that made Daniel's blood run cold, his hands shaking as he unwrapped bundle after bundle of evidence, revealing a truth more malevolent than anyone in Cold Hollow could imagine. There were clothes, lots of them, miners' shirts, women's dresses, children's winter coats, all folded neatly and carefully preserved, but torn in places that suggested they had been hastily cut from their wearers. Several garments had dark stains that Daniel, despite his young age, instinctively recognized as dried blood. The clothes came from different regions, with varying styles and fabrics, suggesting this collection had been amassed over many years from many victims. More disturbing were the personal items: wedding rings, pocket watches, women's hair brooches, children's wooden toys, old daguerreotype photographs, small Bibles, and dozens of other personal effects that families would cherish and never willingly abandon. Each item was cleaned and carefully organized, as if they were trophies being kept for some sick purpose. But what truly horrified Daniel to the point of nausea was the collection of detailed sketches he found, wrapped in an oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. They were anatomical drawings, but they depicted the human body in a way designed for butchery, not healing. The drawings had careful notes on optimal cutting points for maximum yield, preservation methods in freezing conditions, and preparation techniques for various forms of consumption. Some sketches depicted the butchering of large game like deer and bear, with detailed instructions, but others clearly depicted human forms with similar notations, treating the human body as just another source of protein to be harvested and processed. The cold precision of these drawings suggested that their creator had extensive, hands-on experience with the gruesome procedures they illustrated. The cold precision of these drawings, combined with their obvious practical application, showed that their author had extensive hands-on experience with the procedures they illustrated. Daniel rushed back to the tavern, sobbing as he told his mother everything. At first, Martha also thought it was the wild imagination of a child haunted by the harsh winter, but Martha was a practical woman who had learned to trust her son's intuition. When Daniel showed her the silver hair brooch he had taken from the cache, Evelyn Pike's brooch, she had no more doubts. Together, they returned to that cellar. The most horrifying discovery was a leather-bound journal, written in the same small, careful handwriting that had created Varnholt's maps. The entries were dated, stretching back over 5 years, describing what the author called harvests and encounters with traveling parties and isolated families. The journal detailed these encounters with clinical precision, describing the author's growing expertise in field preservation of resources and maintaining supplies during extended periods of isolation. As Martha read through the pages, a horrific pattern emerged. The journal described a systematic process of stalking and trapping travelers, especially families or small groups vulnerable to the harsh mountain conditions. The author had developed sophisticated techniques for approaching potential victims under the guise of offering help, then isolating them in places where they could be killed and processed without risk of discovery. An entry dated nearly 2 years before Varnholt's arrival in Cold Hollow described an encounter with the Pike family of rangers. The journal detailed how the author had offered to guide them through a shortcut, only to lead them into a deadly trap during a snowstorm. What followed was described with the precision of a medical procedure, detailing how each family member was killed and their bodies processed for meat and other useful materials. The journal revealed that this was not random violence or simple murder for robbery. It was a calculated system to obtain human flesh for consumption and for use in the medicines Varnholt had been dispensing to the people of Cold Hollow. The author described human meat as the most perfect protein and detailed various methods for preserving and preparing it for both immediate consumption and long-term storage. Most disturbing were the entries describing the psychological effects of consuming human flesh, both on the author himself and on others who had been gradually introduced to the practice. The journal documented a systematic process of breaking down the innate human revulsion to cannibalism through gradual conditioning. It started with small amounts mixed into other foods and medicines, then gradually increasing the proportion until the subject was consuming pure human tissue without realizing it. The journal described how this process created psychological changes, making the subjects more susceptible to manipulation and more willing to participate in activities they would normally find abhorrent. The author had clearly used this technique to create followers in previous communities, turning ordinary people into willing participants in his cannibalistic practices. As Martha finished reading the most recent entries, she realized with utter horror that everything described in the journal was currently being implemented in Cold Hollow. Varnholt wasn't just feeding the townspeople human flesh, he was systematically converting them into a community of cannibals who would eventually become loyal followers in his ongoing campaign of murder and consumption. Armed with this horrifying evidence, Martha Cleary faced a seemingly impossible decision, one that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The man who had saved her neighbors' lives, who had pulled Cold Hollow back from the brink of collapse during the worst winter, was a monster in human skin, more terrible than anyone could imagine. But how do you accuse the town's savior of being a serial killer and a cannibal, especially when people were still recovering thanks to his medicine, and when those remedies were still keeping the community healthy through the harsh days? The evidence was overwhelming, but Martha realized that simply presenting the journal and the items to the townspeople might not be enough to convince them. Elias Varnholt had built up an almost absolute trust and reverence. People saw him as a miracle worker, a man sent by God to save them. They might dismiss the evidence as fabricated or misinterpreted, especially if Varnholt offered a convincing alternative explanation. Martha decided to go to Dr. Morrow first, hoping the educated man could help her understand what they were facing and devise a plan to expose Varnholt's true face without causing a panic or allowing him to escape. Morrow's reaction was immediate and fierce. He had harbored his own suspicions about Varnholt's methods for weeks, and Daniel's discovery confirmed his worst fears about the true nature of the miraculous medicines. Together, they began a quiet but more systematic investigation into Varnholt's activities and influence in the town. Morrow started asking Varnholt more pointed questions about his botanical knowledge, pressing for specific details about where he had learned his formulation techniques and which scientists had validated his methods. Varnholt's answers were always vague, full of references to masters in ancient lands and sacred knowledge passed down through generations, which outsiders cannot understand without spiritual preparation. When Morrow suggested they work together to document Varnholt's techniques for the benefit of the medical community, potentially publishing their findings in medical journals to help other communities, the stranger became visibly agitated. He insisted that his methods were not meant for outsiders, and sharing them would strip them of their healing power and could cause great harm. When Morrow suggested they work together to document Varnholt's techniques for the benefit of medicine, potentially publishing their findings in medical journals to spread these useful treatments to other communities across New York, the stranger became visibly agitated. He insisted that his methods were not for the uninitiated, and that sharing them with those who hadn't been properly initiated would strip them of their healing power and could cause great harm. Meanwhile, Martha, using her connections with the few traders and hunters who occasionally passed through the tavern, quietly began gathering information about disappearances that had occurred in the Adirondacks over the past few years. What she discovered painted a terrifying picture, far beyond anything she had initially suspected. Families traveling through the mountains had vanished with alarming frequency over the past 5 years. Hunting parties had failed to return from what should have been routine expeditions. Lone travelers had simply vanished into the wilderness, sometimes leaving behind abandoned wagons or campsites that looked as if they had been hastily vacated. In each case, the disappearances occurred during the winter months, when harsh weather made extensive searches impossible, and when bodies might never be found. The most chilling discovery came when Martha heard stories from an old fur trapper who had traveled all over the Northeast. He told of similar incidents stretching back over a decade, following a trail that seemed to move systematically through remote areas of New York, Pennsylvania, and even Ohio. Each area would experience a period of mysterious disappearances lasting a few years, often followed by reports of a helpful stranger appearing during a time of crisis, someone with medical knowledge and survival skills that seemed too perfect to be coincidental. In a logging camp in Pennsylvania in 1848, a mysterious herbalist named Elias Thorne had appeared during a fever outbreak, saving dozens of lives before disappearing in the spring along with a few families who had supposedly gone to seek their fortune elsewhere. In a small farming community in Ohio during the harsh winter of 1850, a man calling himself Elias Vane had provided crucial assistance during a crop failure, only to vanish when people started asking questions about the origin of the dried meat he provided. The pattern was identical in each location: arrival during a crisis, establishing trust through effective medical treatment, gradual introduction of strange practices and medicines, and finally his own disappearance, along with several townspeople, or relocation to a new hunting ground. Meanwhile, Dr. Morrow made his own disturbing discovery while conducting a more thorough examination of some of Varnholt's preserved medicines. Using simple chemical tests he had learned during his time in Philadelphia, Dr. Morrow confirmed his worst suspicions about the true composition of these miraculous remedies. The medicines not only contained human tissue, but tissue from multiple different individuals, suggesting Varnholt had access to a large supply of human remains that he was systematically processing for various purposes. Even more horrifying was Morrow's realization that the medicines were designed to be psychologically addictive. The chemical analysis, though crude, indicated compounds that affected brain function, making patients crave continued treatment while simultaneously making them more susceptible to psychological manipulation. The miraculous recoveries were not just the result of effective medicine, they were the product of a sophisticated system of chemical conditioning that made patients dependent on their savior while gradually breaking down their moral resistance to increasingly disturbing practices. When Dr. Morrow attempted to confront Varnholt about these findings, the man's reaction was swift and terrifying in its cold honesty. Instead of denying the accusations or expressing outrage, Varnholt seemed almost relieved that someone had finally understood the complexity of his work. "You do not understand the necessities of true survival, Doctor," Varnholt said, his gray eyes flashing with a predatory light that sent a chill down Morrow's spine. "In the places I have been, in the situations I have faced, one learns that the boundaries between medicine and other necessities become meaningless when survival is at stake. The human body provides what the human body needs, if one has the knowledge and the will to use it correctly." Varnholt continued his explanation with the calm precision of a lecturing professor. "Your civilized society has created false taboos around the most natural and efficient forms of sustenance. My ancestors learned long ago that those taboos are luxuries that only the weak and well-fed can afford. When winter comes, when food runs out, when death knocks on every door, such squeamishness is not only foolish, but actively detrimental to existence." Dr. Morrow left that conversation convinced that Elias Varnholt was not just a killer, he was something far worse. He was a cannibal who had perfected his methods over many years, using scientific knowledge to justify and refine his horrific activities, while developing techniques to convert entire communities to his twisted and brutal worldview. The situation in Cold Hollow began to escalate rapidly as more and more townspeople exhibited the behavioral changes that Dr. Morrow had documented. The craving for meat became more pronounced. Several families reported that their relatives would wake up in the middle of the night, rummaging for any piece of meat left and eating it raw and ravenously. Children began playing increasingly violent games, simulating the hunt and food preparation with frightening detail. Adults started hoarding personal items of the deceased, saying they were keeping a part of their memory, but displaying a possessiveness that was more predatory than nostalgic. Most disturbing was the way the townspeople began to view outsiders and potential travelers with a cold, calculating gaze. When a lost hunter from another town stumbled into Cold Hollow one day in March, a group of villagers gathered, observing the stranger with an expression that Dr. Morrow described in his journal as the look of a hungry wolf pack assessing its prey. The breaking point came when the weaver's young daughter, the girl Varnholt had saved, began to show symptoms that made it clear just how far his influence had spread. The girl developed an insatiable hunger for meat, specifically raw meat. She constantly had vivid nightmares about the people in the snow who wanted to share their feast with her and teach her the old ways of eating. Her mother found her in the shed at midnight, gnawing on a raw piece of salted venison with an expression of pure, primal hunger. The little girl's small hands and face were smeared with blood and grease. When her mother tried to take the meat away, the girl actually growled like a wild animal, and bared her teeth as if ready to bite anyone who came between her and her food. The child's eyes held the same cold, vacant gray light they had all learned to recognize in Elias Varnholt, and when she spoke, her voice carried the same unsettling cadence and vocabulary that had become the hallmark of Varnholt's Cured. "The teacher says," the girl said, licking her bloody fingers with a ghastly pleasure. "He says the old people were wrong to waste good food just because it walked on 2 legs instead of 4. He says, when we learn the right way to eat, we will never be hungry again, and we will never have to fear the winter." Mrs. Weaver realized with dawning horror that her daughter had been systematically conditioned to accept cannibalism not just as acceptable, but as desirable, and this conditioning was spreading throughout the community under the guise of medical treatment and survival education. That same night, Mr. Weaver went looking for Elias Varnholt to ask about his daughter's condition. He found Varnholt in the family's shed, working by lantern light over what appeared to be a large piece of meat spread across the table used for butchering pigs. But as Mr. Weaver looked closer, he realized with a sickening certainty that what Varnholt was cutting and preparing was not any animal they owned. The meat was pale and fine-textured, with a bone structure that was unmistakably human. Varnholt was working with practiced efficiency, his strange tools glinting in the lamplight as he separated different cuts and wrapped them in treated cloth for preservation. Around him were small wooden boxes containing what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all carefully marked with symbols that matched those in his mysterious journal. When Varnholt noticed Mr. Weaver standing frozen in the doorway, he showed no sign of shame or alarm. Instead, he smiled that cold smile and gestured for Mr. Weaver to come closer, as if inviting him to observe a useful demonstration. "Ah, Mr. Weaver," Varnholt said in his calm, measured voice. "Perfect timing. I was hoping the man of the house would take an interest in learning these techniques. Your daughter is showing remarkable progress in accepting the new ways. It would be beneficial for you to understand the practical aspects of what we are doing here." Mr. Weaver stood motionless in the doorway, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing and hearing. Varnholt continued his work while explaining his methods in the casual tone of someone discussing farm chores. "This came from the lost hunter last week," Varnholt said, indicating the meat he was processing. "The poor fellow was already near death from exposure when I found him in the woods. Rather than let these valuable resources go to waste, I have preserved what can be used for the community's benefit. The remedy I prepared for your daughter contained a portion of this tissue. That is why her recovery was so complete and remarkable." The implications of Varnholt's words struck Mr. Weaver like a physical blow. This man was not only processing human corpses for food and medicine, but he had fed human flesh to his own daughter under the guise of medical treatment. "You're feeding my family human beings," Mr. Weaver whispered, his voice barely audible. "I am feeding your family the most nutritious and spiritually potent sustenance available," Varnholt corrected calmly. "In my homeland, we understand that the consumption of human flesh creates bonds between people that are far deeper than ordinary social relationships. Those who share in the sacred feast become part of an eternal community, transcending the trivial boundaries of life and death." Varnholt set down his tools and turned to face Mr. Weaver directly, his grey eyes shining with the fervor of a prophet. "Your family is being transformed, Mr. Weaver. Your daughter is being prepared for a life where she will never again fear hunger, cold, or isolation. She is learning to see the world as it truly island, a place where the strong survive by consuming the weak, where waste is the only sin, and where every death provides the opportunity for continued life." Just when we thought we had reached the abyss of horror, what happened in Cold Hollow escalated beyond all imagination. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's find out what happens next, because what Mr. Weaver witnessed in his shed was only the beginning of Elias Varnholt's final revelation. The confrontation that would decide the fate of Cold Hollow took place on the 20th of March, 1853, on a night later remembered as the bloodiest in the town's history. Dr. Morrow and Mrs. Martha Cleary had spent the previous day gathering evidence and allies, finally convincing Pastor Whitlock and a few brave miners that Elias Varnholt was a mortal threat to their community. The decision to act was forced by increasingly desperate circumstances. More townspeople had disappeared, and those who remained were slowly being transformed into creatures they no longer recognized. More townspeople were showing signs of psychological conditioning. Children would disappear for hours and return with blood on their clothes and a secretive look, and some families were horrified to find human bones hidden in their sheds. The plan was to confront and apprehend Varnholt at the church, where he was gathering his followers, and to search for evidence to present to the county authorities. But Varnholt had been watching the community's leaders as carefully as they had been watching him. When the brave group, consisting of Dr. Morrow, Martha Cleary, Pastor Whitlock, and 3 courageous miners, approached the church that evening, they found the scene transformed into something from their worst nightmares. The church was eerily quiet, but candlelight flickered from every window, creating dancing shadows on the walls, as if they were performing a macabre dance. It was too quiet for a gathering. The silence was broken only by a low, rhythmic sound that none of them could immediately identify, something between a hum and a chant, with a cadence that seemed to match the beating of a human heart. Mr. Weaver blocked their way at the door, but the man who greeted them was no longer the gentle farmer they once knew. Something was wrong with his eyes. They held the same vacant, predatory expression they had learned to recognize in all those Varnholt had cured, but it was intensified to a degree that made him seem almost inhuman. His movements were fluid and controlled, like a predator stalking its prey, and his smile revealed teeth that somehow seemed sharper than they should have been. Behind him, his wife, Mrs. Weaver, stood motionless beside other converted townspeople. Her hands were stained with what looked like blood. Her once neat dress was torn and soiled, her hair hung loose, and her face wore an expression of beatific calm that was somehow more terrifying than outright madness. "Elias has taught us about true survival," Mr. Weaver said in a voice that was not entirely his own. The words carried Varnholt's distinct cadence and rhythm, as if he were reciting memorized lessons about the communion that binds a community in the deepest winter and the sacred responsibilities that come with understanding the true nature of sustenance. "Would you like to learn?" Dr. Morrow pushed Mr. Weaver aside, a physician's instinct overriding his fear as he tried to understand what had happened to these people. What he found inside the church was a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life, a nightmare that combined religious ritual with butchery in ways that challenged his every understanding of the limits of humanity. The pews in the nave had been cleared. The main altar had been dragged to the center of the room, surrounded by long benches arranged in a perfect circle. Around this makeshift altar sat the converted townspeople, the Weaver family, the mother, the older daughter, and the young son, along with several miners and their families, all sat with the same vacant, predatory expression as the man at the door. In the center of the circle, Elias Varnholt knelt beside the altar, which was covered with a white cloth now soaked with dark stains. On it lay what Dr. Morrow initially thought was a butchered deer, but as his eyes adjusted to the candlelight, he realized with a sickening certainty that they were human remains. The body had been systematically dismembered with surgical precision. Different cuts were separated and arranged as if for some grotesque feast. Around the altar were small wooden boxes containing what appeared to be organs and other body parts, all carefully prepared and marked with the same symbols from Varnholt's journal. The cold precision of the butchery, combined with the ritualistic arrangement of the scene, suggested this was not random violence, but part of a meticulously planned ceremony. "Ah, Doctor," Varnholt said without looking up, his voice retaining the calm, measured tone he always used when discussing his remedies. "Perfect timing. We were just conducting the final stage of initiation for these people into the deeper mysteries of survival. You see, theoretical knowledge can only take one so far. True understanding requires direct participation in the sacred feast." Varnholt slowly stood up, his strange instruments glinting in the candlelight like the sacrificial tools of an ancient rite. "The people who disappeared in the mountains did not die of cold or hunger, Doctor. They became part of something much larger and more meaningful. They contributed to the survival of a community that could use their resources more efficiently than they ever could have themselves." Doctor Morrow realized with utter horror that everyone in the church was staring at his group with a barely restrained hunger. Their eyes followed every movement with the focused attention of predators assessing prey. Whatever Varnholt had been feeding these people, whatever psychological conditioning he had implemented, had transformed them on a fundamental level, far beyond mere mental influence. "You've poisoned them," Morrow whispered, his voice lost in the still air of the church. "Conditioned them to accept necessity." Varnholt interrupted, his voice now taking on the fervent tone of a prophet preaching his gospel. "To accept the truth your civilized society has tried to deny, that survival requires the strong to consume the weak, that waste is the only sin, and that the human body is the most perfect sustenance for human life." Varnholt gestured toward the arranged body parts on the altar with unconcealed pride. "In my homeland, which exists wherever winter is coldest and resources are scarcest, we learned that unity requires sacrifice. The many must sustain the few who are capable of leading them through the darkest of times. These people have been transformed from weak, fearful creatures into something stronger, more unified, and capable of surviving anything this world throws at them." Pastor Whitlock, who had been silent until now, suddenly found his trembling voice. "You're talking about cannibalism, about the crime of murder. You're turning these people into monsters like yourself, abandoning every principle that separates man from beast." Varnholt's laugh was the most chilling sound any of them had ever heard. It was not the laugh of a madman, but the genuinely amused response of someone who found their ignorance more pitiable than offensive. "Monsters, Pastor. Look around you carefully. These people are healthier than they have been all winter. Their children are growing strong and learning skills that will help them survive. Their families are united in purpose, in ways your empty promises of heaven could never achieve. I have given them something infinitely more valuable than abstract moral principles. I have given them the tools and the mindset to survive." The confrontation that followed was swift, brutal, and unlike anything the people of Cold Hollow had ever experienced. Varnholt's followers attacked the intruders with a savage coordination, moving like a pack of wolves that had hunted together many times. Their movements were fluid and practiced, suggesting this was not the first time they had been called upon to defend their transformed community. Mr. Weaver moved with extraordinary speed, his calloused farmer's hands becoming claws aimed at Dr. Morrow. Mrs. Weaver pulled a kitchen knife from her blood-stained dress and lunged at Pastor Whitlock with the cold determination of someone trained for this very moment. Most horrifying were the children. The Weaver daughter and son, along with the other children, attacked with terrifying coordination. Their small size allowed them to slip under the adults' defenses, while their complete lack of fear or hesitation made them far more dangerous than their age would suggest. They had been transformed into something no longer human, retaining their childish appearance, but possessing the instincts of congenital predators. The Weaver daughter and son, along with the other children, attacked with a coordination that showed they had been well trained. Their small size allowed them to slip under the men's defenses, while their complete lack of fear or hesitation made them far more dangerous than their age would suggest. They had been transformed into something not quite human, retaining their childlike appearance while harboring the predatory instincts of born killers. Dr. Morrow found himself fighting for his life against the very people he had known and treated for years. People whose children he had delivered, whose ailments he had cured, but the individuals attacking him now only bore a physical resemblance to the miners and families he had once called neighbors. Their personalities, their moral frameworks, their fundamental understanding of right and wrong had been systematically dismantled and rebuilt, according to Elias Varnholt's twisted philosophy. The battle was desperate and chaotic, fought with pickaxes, kitchen knives, and bare hands in the confined space of the church. The followers fought with the utter ferocity of those defending not just their lives but their entire worldview. Meanwhile, Dr. Morrow's group fought with the desperation of men who understood that failure meant not just death, but the complete corruption of everything they believed in. Dr. Morrow managed to escape, carrying news of the horror back to the rest of Cold Hollow while bleeding from multiple wounds, his mind seared with images that would never fade. Martha Cleary, with the quick wits of someone accustomed to danger, managed to flee back to the tavern, where she and her son barricaded themselves. The others passed a Whitlock, and the three brave miners disappeared into the nightmare the church had become. By dawn, the remaining, unconverted people of Cold Hollow were gathering in the tavern, preparing for a fight to end Elias Varnholt's reign of terror. But they were no longer facing a single deranged individual. They were facing an organized community of converts who had been systematically prepared for this very confrontation and who regarded their approaching neighbors not as old friends, but as enemies threatening everything they had learned to believe in. But they were no longer fighting a single deranged individual. They were facing an organized community of converts who had been systematically prepared for this very confrontation and who regarded the approaching townspeople not as neighbors trying to save them, but as enemies threatening everything they had learned to cherish. The standoff at Cold Hollow lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, becoming a nightmare of guerrilla warfare fought between former neighbors who no longer recognized each other as human. The unconverted townspeople, led by Dr. Morrow and Martha Cleary from the tavern, found themselves fighting not just for their lives, but for the soul of their community, against people they had known and trusted for years. Elias Varnholt had prepared for this eventuality with characteristic thoroughness. The church and surrounding buildings had been turned into a fortress with barricades and defensive positions, suggesting months of planning. The converts had stockpiled weapons, mostly sharpened farm tools along with food and medicine to withstand a siege. Most disturbingly, they fought with a coordination and tactical knowledge that indicated extensive training in organized violence. The unconverted townspeople quickly realized they were outmatched. Varnholt's followers moved through the buildings and surrounding woods with the fluid coordination of predators who had practiced together. They used the terrain to their advantage, employing ambushes and psychological warfare that broke down the attackers' morale as much as their numbers. But perhaps the most effective weapon in Varnholt's arsenal was the converts themselves, having to witness their former neighbors, friends, and relatives transformed into predatory creatures, willing to kill and cannibalize anyone who opposed them, had a devastating psychological effect on Dr. Morrow's group. Many simply could not bring themselves to use lethal force against people they had known since childhood, even as those people were trying to kill them. Dr. Morrow documented this confrontation in the final pages of his journal, providing a detailed account of what experts would later consider one of the most successful examples of mass psychological conversion in American history. His writings describe the heartbreaking moments when fathers had to fight their own children, when wives faced husbands across barricades, when the fundamental bonds of community and family were exposed as far more fragile than anyone could have imagined. At dawn on the 3rd day, the confrontation ended, not with a victory for either side, but with the complete disappearance of Elias Varnholt and his most loyal followers. When the exhausted townspeople finally broke into the church, they found it empty, except for evidence of a hasty retreat. Varnholt and his converts had vanished into the mountains, taking with them weapons, medicine, and preserved food, enough to help them survive indefinitely in the wilderness. The aftermath of Elias Varnholt's departure left Cold Hollow a broken community, a scar that would never heal. Of those who had fallen under his influence, only a few ever returned. They trickled back to town in the following weeks and months, hollow-eyed, silent, and refusing to speak of what they had experienced in the woods with their teacher. Most of these survivors left Cold Hollow within a year, unable to bear the horrific memories and the suspicious gazes of their former neighbors who could never be sure that the conversion process had truly been reversed. Some moved to large cities to start over. Others simply disappeared into the Wild West, perhaps seeking communities where their changed perspectives and unusual skills would be less noticeable. Dr. Morrow spent the remaining years of his life documenting everything he could remember about Varnholt's methods, his teachings, and the systematic process by which an ordinary community had been transformed into a cannibalistic cult. His journal, preserved by the Cleary family for generations, provides the most detailed account of what experts now believe was one of America's first recorded cases of mass psychological conditioning used to overcome the most fundamental moral taboos. The physical evidence was damning enough, but there was no one left to convict. When spring came and the snow melted, search parties discovered multiple caches scattered throughout the Adirondack Mountains, filled with preserved human remains and the personal effects of dozens of missing persons spanning several years. The scale of Varnholt's activities became clear. He had been operating across the Northeast for at least a decade, preying on travelers and isolated families while perfecting his methods of psychological manipulation and human preservation. These caches revealed the sophisticated nature of Varnholt's operation. He had established permanent supply depots throughout the wilderness, each containing full equipment for butchering, preserving, and storing human flesh, along with chemicals for creating the medicines he used to condition his victims. The scale and organization of these facilities suggested Varnholt was not acting alone, but was part of a larger network, an organization of individuals engaged in similar activities throughout the wilderness. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came in late April, when a group of hunters found a seemingly abandoned settlement deep in the mountains, far from any established trail. The site included sophisticated food preservation equipment, strangely designed medical instruments, workshops for producing the unique tools and clothing Varnholt had carried, and most importantly, detailed journals documenting his experiments in what he called survival psychology. These journals revealed that his activities in Cold Hollow were not random predation or simple cannibalism driven by hunger or madness. They were part of a carefully planned and methodically executed experiment to create self-sustaining communities based on what Varnholt described as post-civilizational survival protocols. His ultimate goal, and that of the White Snow Council he mentioned, was apparently to develop techniques to maintain human communities during prolonged periods of societal collapse. They used methods that completely abandoned conventional moral constraints in favor of pure survival efficiency. The journals described similar experiments conducted in other isolated communities across the Northeast for nearly 15 years, each following the same basic pattern: infiltration, building trust, conversion, and finally, harvest or relocation. Infiltration during a time of crisis, establishing trust through genuine medical assistance, gradual introduction of unconventional survival practices, systematic psychological conditioning to overcome moral resistance, and finally, either the complete conversion of the community or the elimination of witnesses, followed by relocation to a new testing ground. Most chilling were the detailed entries describing Varnholt's long-term plans to expand his operations. He had identified dozens of vulnerable communities throughout the mountains of the Northeast and had developed comprehensive strategies to infiltrate and convert each one. His ultimate vision seemed to be the creation of a network of cannibalistic communities, able to support each other through the harshest winters and most severe societal disruptions, gradually spreading his philosophy throughout the isolated regions and beyond. The journals also revealed that Varnholt was not the mastermind. but rather a field operative working for the so-called White Snow Council, a larger organization apparently dedicated to developing and testing survival strategies for a foreseen societal collapse. References to the council and the directors suggested his work was being monitored and guided by individuals with extensive resources and long-term planning capabilities. Elias Varnholt himself was never captured, despite searches by local authorities following the disjointed accounts from Cold Hollow. Not a single trace of him was found after he vanished into the forest. Some believed he died in the wilderness. Others believed he simply moved on to a new region, ready to begin his horrific work again, in a place where no one would recognize his methods or connect him to previous events. The truth may be more disturbing than either theory. In 1857, just 4 years after the Cold Hollow incident, reports began to surface from isolated mining camps in the Appalachian Mountains of a helpful herbalist who appeared during harsh winters, offering medical aid and survival advice to struggling families. In 1860, similar reports came from remote areas of Michigan, describing a man with cold gray eyes and medical knowledge who seemed to know exactly what people needed to hear in their darkest moments. Each incident followed the same pattern that had devastated Cold Hollow: arrival during a crisis, establishing trust through effective medical treatment, gradual introduction of unconventional practices, and eventually, the complete conversion of the target community, or mysterious disappearances followed by the stranger's departure. The last recorded appearance of someone matching Varnholt's description was in 1861, amidst the chaos of the Civil War, at an isolated military outpost in Missouri. Desperate conditions during a brutal winter had left the soldiers vulnerable to anyone offering hope and help. Witnesses described a doctor with cold gray eyes and prematurely silver hair, who claimed to come from lands where the old laws of survival are still honored. He stayed for 3 months, helping the soldiers survive the disease and starvation that had already killed dozens of their comrades. His medicines were remarkably effective. His advice on preserving and rationing food helped the entire camp hold out through the winter. When spring came and reinforcements finally reached the outpost, the mysterious doctor had vanished, taking with him a platoon of 15 soldiers who were never seen again. The subsequent military report, found in the National Archives, noted disturbing details about the condition of the remaining soldiers. They hoarded food obsessively, had a preference for raw meat, and displayed a brutal hierarchical structure, very different from standard military discipline. Dr. Morrow's final journal entry, written shortly before he died of old age and a broken heart in 1870, contained a warning that has haunted anyone who has read it. The man we knew as Elias Varnholt understood something about human nature that civilized people always try to ignore. That under the right conditions, with the right techniques and infinite patience, anyone can be convinced that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but necessary for survival. He didn't create monsters from ordinary people. He merely revealed the monster that had always existed within them, waiting for permission to emerge. Morrow's warning proved prophetic. The brutality of the Civil War, the industrial disasters, and the economic crises that followed repeatedly demonstrated how quickly civilized communities could descend into savage competition for resources when survival became the only concern. Modern psychological research has confirmed many of Dr. Morrow's observations about the techniques Elias Varnholt and the White Snow Council used to convert an entire community to their twisted worldview. The story of Cold Hollow shows that the greatest horrors in human history often come not from supernatural forces, but from the systematic exploitation of human psychology by individuals who understand how to manipulate our deepest instincts. Studies on cult indoctrination, military conditioning, and survival psychology have identified the same basic principles that Varnholt applied with such devastating efficiency: gradual introduction of extreme concepts, creation of dependency, relationships, isolation from alternative viewpoints, and the systematic breaking of moral boundaries through small steps, each of which seems reasonable in a context of desperation. This mystery shows us that the greatest horrors in human history often come not from supernatural forces or random violence, but from the systematic exploitation of human psychology by individuals who understand how to manipulate our deepest instincts and most basic needs. The story of Elias Varnholt reminds us that civilization is far more fragile than we believe, and that the line between savior and destroyer, between teacher and corrupter, can vanish completely when survival becomes the only remaining virtue. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed, or could there be more to the true identity of Elias Varnholt and the White Snow Council he served? Leave your comment below and share your theories on what truly drove these individuals to such extremes, and whether their network of survival communities might still silently exist in the remote areas of our country. If you enjoyed this dark tale from America's hidden history and want more stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with a friend who loves historical mysteries that make you question how much we really know about the people around us. See you in the next video, where we will explore another chapter from the shadows of American history that the authorities tried to bury forever.